everybody, and welcome to Mass Culture's first digital gathering about municipal cultural planning. I'm making sure that everything is live and looking good. Okay. All right, so my name is Bridget McIntosh and I'll be your facilitator for today. Just wanted to give some thanks to the Ontario Trillium Foundation for hosting us today and to the Mass Culture staff for putting this event together. We're really excited to discuss everything that we can about municipal cultural planning and dig deep into this topic. Before we begin, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that our work today, taking place at the Ontario Trillium Foundation's head office, is located on the traditional Indigenous territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is part of the Dish of One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Toronto, and in every city, town, and community in which each of you reside, is still home to Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to meet and work on this territory. We also acknowledge that the reach of our work today extends beyond to other traditional Indigenous territories. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we are using, and honor all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the land since time immemorial. Okay, just moving on. So mass culture, just to give you a bit of background about mass culture, it began in 2018 and was focused on discussion of a model that was to support accurate, holistic data and communications about cultural policy in Canada. You can read more about their work online. As we may have seen online, this digital gathering is the first of its kind, and it's an evolution in how we gather relevant data about cultural policy. It's an experiment, and so we're hoping that this webinar isn't really so much about myself and the panelists talking to you, but talking with you. And we really want to encourage engagement, conversation, and dialogue. Pat, Sanjay, and Branislav are joining me today to share their insights and to discuss based on their experience, but we are looking to you as well, the participants, experts in your own field, and the practitioners on the front lines to share what your experiences are so that we can learn from it and transfer all of this knowledge to the Ontario Trillium Foundation's Knowledge Centre. So the Knowledge Centre, again, an initiative by the OTF, will be where this conversation will continue, and we hope that we will continue to look at that as a resource to gather expertise and to answer all of the questions that I'm sure many of you have about cultural planning and how we can make them mobilized, effective, and a huge part of making vibrant and livable cities. I also want to acknowledge that we have a whole staff here who are engaged in social media activity. We are live tweeting using the hashtag #MCDigital. So again, please use this opportunity to share your experiences, your resources, so that we can all learn from them. And just as we move on, I do want to acknowledge we have close to 400 people from across the country and across the US who have registered for this webinar. We are overwhelmed with the response, and we have all levels of government, funding agencies, arts service organizations who are joining us. We know that this topic is massive, and we have no expectation that we're going to be able to answer everyone's questions and to really get into the topic within 60 minutes. But again, this is a start. We do want to hear from you. We do want to hear what your questions are. We want to be able to capture all of them through our chat box. You should be able to see that as part of your interface. And we will transfer all of that information over to the Knowledge Center so that we can continue the conversation. And I'm joined today again with Patrick Tobin, Sanjay Shahani, and Branislav Henselmann. More about their work and a bit about them can be found on our website. So I encourage you to go to the website, read up about them, and also read more about the plans and the great work that they are doing in their communities. To focus today's conversation, we were going to focus on two things. The first being to discuss ways to mobilize cultural plans into action, and then hopefully get into looking at ways that arts and culture can be incorporated into city resiliency building initiatives. We are working on an assumption that most of you who are joining us today have cultural plans in place or in the process of revamping them or developing them. So we'll go from that point of view, and I will start the conversation with Pat, Sanjay, and Branislav. And at points throughout our chat, you'll see that I'll throw it to the audience and ask you to share some of your experiences and your happenings of what's going on in your community in the chat box. So for example, like just trends, what's hot in your community, what's going on. Again, this is an opportunity for us to just capture all of the information that's out there and hopefully identify trends that are happening in the sector. Okay, so I'm just going to move on and begin. You'll see on your screen that, again, we have the chat box, the MC Digital hashtag, Mass Cultures on Twitter, and throughout this conversation and afterwards, please do share your resources and your information with us. Okay, so question one. I'm going to start with you, Sanjay, because you've got some interesting work that's happening in Edmonton with your Connections and Exchanges plan. So I'm hoping you can tell us about a strong example where you've created or collaborated with the arts community to help mobilize that new plan into action.
Thank you, Bridget. And I just want to also thank my fellow panelists and everybody else who's online. Thank you for the opportunity of sharing what we're doing in Edmonton. Hopefully it'll be useful. So what I'd like to say is that, you know, this process that we've gone through in Edmonton, the process itself was a fairly engaged and involved process. From start to finish, it took us about 18 months to build Connections and Exchanges. Right from the beginning of the process, we were very clear and careful in how we thought through the entire building of the plan. So prior to Connections and Exchanges, we had the Art of Living, which was Edmonton's first culture plan, really. That was resourced by City Council. I should point out that the Edmonton Arts Council is not a city department. It is an independent agency, but has responsibility over cultural development in the city. The city itself has no cultural department. They've given everything over to the Edmonton Arts Council. And the Edmonton Arts Council does a number of things, including investing. So we give grants, we administer the entire public art and conservation program, we operate a community box office, and we also have a retail operation to sell artist work. We do all the partnerships on behalf of the city, and we also do programming in the civic precinct and other parts of the city. So when we started this process, we had information from the Art of Living that we could use, and we built the process around 4 key principles. I'm going to use that as a really important foundational piece for an example, because we knew after the Art of Living that it was important that Edmonton had changed from 2008. It was now a younger city. It was a more diverse city. It was also a city that was quickly becoming the largest urban space in the country for Indigenous people. And I believe that's going to happen in the next 3 years, where Edmonton will actually have more Indigenous people than Winnipeg will. Mm-hmm. We also knew that the city itself, from a population standpoint, was expanding, and Edmonton was no longer just a city on its own, but in fact, it had an impact on the region itself. So the capital region of Alberta, which Edmonton is the capital, mm-hmm. Includes many small communities. So we had 4 principles that we used to guide us through the consultation process and the building of the plan. The first one was the principle of inclusivity, which was really key to how the Arts Council and our partners, the Heritage Council and Arts Habitat Edmonton, would proceed along with the city. The second principle was a cluster of interrelated principles that actually were going to focus on leadership, excellence, and innovation within the sector. So both arts and heritage. The third principle was a principle of collective responsibility, because this being a city plan, we wanted to make sure that the values that Edmonton holds in terms of its own identity were important, and as well as the civic importance of culture was a shared responsibility, not just a responsibility for the sector, but actually for the entire city itself, including the administration. And then the fourth principle, which was key and is really important, and you'll see in the plan, is that we wanted to have a real focus on the economic security for the arts. We wanted to make sure that Edmonton became a place that created the conditions for artists to live, work, and play in a sustainable way. And resiliency, which is part 2 of your question, is really focused around those questions.
Excellent. I'm going to jump in really quickly. We did have a question, just high level, to talk about where each of you are from. So for those listening in, Sanjay Shahani is the Executive Director of the Edmonton Arts Council, which has been directed by Council to deliver that city's cultural plan, their new culture plan. Pat Tobin is the Director of Arts and Culture Services from the City of Toronto, who has, they've just recently created a divisional strategy that builds upon former cultural plans. And Branislav Henselmann is the Managing Director of Cultural Services from the City of Vancouver, who are also embarking on a new creative city strategy to build upon former cultural work. So hope that answers the question out there. Sanjay, sorry, is there anything else that you would like to add to?
I just want to say that the key element of building connections and exchanges based on those 4 principles was to develop a fairly robust methodology that really was a methodology for public engagement. So we did not stop at consultations and engagement with the sector itself, but we actually broadened it to the entire city, as well as all the stakeholders within that. And so it was a layered strategy, and it's all documented in the plan, which was unanimously approved by Council last October. And we were also, as the Edmonton Arts Council, were given additional funds to implement the first phase, the first 4 years of the plan. So I'll stop there.
Excellent, great. And I'll go over to Branislav as well. So similarly, you are doing a new creative city strategy that's building upon former work. And I know you've just recently joined the city, if I'm correct, specifically to work on this plan. So I'm hoping you can talk to us about your methodology there. And in working with the community, is there anything that you feel that you are, that's interesting or that is helping you anticipate or compensate for challenges and to deal with those challenges?
These are all very, very good questions.
Yeah.
But just to start us off in the right way, I know you've done the land acknowledgement for Toronto. I would just like to do one for Vancouver as well.
Absolutely.
We are here on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Musqueam Small Business Commission that's labeled to nations, and we're very grateful for that. And in fact, actually, I'm joining you guys from the Post at 7:50, the Push Festival, which is in full swing. So you're right, Bridget. I joined the Cultural Services Department just about 2 years ago now. And one of the first things that the staff and I were directed to do is actually develop a new vision for culture and creativity in Vancouver. And that vision was supposed to, and is still supposed to encompass both addressing current and emerging challenges and opportunities. It is supposed to reflect the culture and history of the city, which is of course very important. But to something that you were saying earlier, it is also looking to interface with other city policies and strategies. And this has been actually one of our big points as we've been developing this work.
Sorry, excuse me, Branislav, a tech note. I'm just getting a note for you to increase your volume if possible. Okay. Sorry about that.
You know what? I will speak up. Maybe that will help as well.
Great.
And so to do that, of course, we were directed to work with the many stakeholders in the city, the many communities that actually make up Vancouver and the way it is. And so I came to the city about 2 years ago, not from a planning background. I have been in the sector most of my life. And so I'm very, very, very happy and delighted actually that I get to work with some. Yes.
I'm so sorry, Branislav, we're still having some volume issues, and I don't know if your tablet is on full blast. And I know, just want to make sure everyone can hear what you're sharing with us.
Yes. Is this any better?
Test 1, 2, 3, checking with my crew here. Excellent. Yes, we are good. Thank you. Thanks everyone for bearing with us. Again, new technology, experiment. Think of it as a pilot project. So.
As I was saying, I'm really, really delighted that I have a chance to speak, to work here with some of the most gifted cultural planners that I've encountered. Having said that, I haven't worked in other municipalities, but they're really, really an incredible bunch. And so we actually took a little time to think about what the approach should be to this new cultural strategy, the Creative City strategy. And similar to Edmonton, we looked at, first of all, a set of guiding principles. And as the City of Reconciliation, of course, one of our most important guiding principles is the commitment to reconciliation. So that's number one. The second principle actually is a multifaceted one, and it is the commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion, and access.
Okay, excellent. Sorry, Branislav, sorry to interrupt again, because I see that there's a lot of chat activity that's happening, and our attendees may not be aware that in order to see the chat, the attendees will need to manually click the chat box and have it scroll down. I believe I'm conveying that message correctly, but I want to make sure that everybody who is in attendance can see the conversation that's happening and know how to access that. And I'm also getting a volume note as well, Branislav. I know you're in the middle of the Push Festival and in transit. If there's any other way that you're able to pump up the volume, we'll try our best.
Okay. I can look at it once again. I'm not entirely sure why it's not working. Like I said, I'm just going to try to project a little more and try not to shout at everyone.
Thank you.
So with the guiding principles, again, of reconciliation, equity, diversity, inclusion, and access, we have actually started looking at what this Creative City strategy would look like. And those principles have guided both the approach in terms of research, and of course there is qualitative and quantitative research, as well as engagement. And so one of the things that we have recognized is that the internal engagement is just as important as the external engagement. And that throughout the engagement, and this is a very important note, we have committed to looking at who's not represented around the table, who are the underrepresented groups, through an iterative question, which is who is not around the table, and also lowering barriers. And lowering barriers has been so important for us because we recognize that there are biases, power biases in every group. And so with that in mind, we have devised the way to engage with the public through a number of different ways. Focus groups that were both for those who are underrepresented, as well as the regular grantees that we actually already are interacting with, but also very much showing the lens of intersectionality, understanding that there is no one note identity, that in fact we're actually dealing with many identities. And another thing that we have done to reduce those power structures is actually we have started a grant stream to allow organizations to hold their own sessions and discuss the issues and help us name and surface those challenges that we're seeing in Vancouver. Because the Creative City strategy itself could only be authentic if we were really guided by our principles, if it was based on those challenges and on those issues that were surfacing from the community directly. And so I, for example, wasn't in any of the many focus groups because I realized that as soon as I, within the power structure, enter a room, the conversations would change. Instead, the groups had an opportunity to speak with me directly in another setting. We also had, like I said, a number of not just focus group, but also open conversations outside of the general focus group idea. We will be holding a summit very soon, but we've also done surveys online in both English and Chinese, for example. So these are just some of the ways that we have been approaching this and have been garnering some incredible information.
Excellent. And just to play off of that, so again, looking at the Edmonton experience and the Vancouver experience and even the Toronto experience, you've all had culture plans that have existed and have either the term has run out and now you've been directed by council to create new policies. Have you found that, I guess, any issues or any challenges that were in the previous plans that you're compensating for them in the development of your new plans? And are you finding that there is greater engagement now with like arts communities based on the feedback from previous culture plans and just learning from what may have gone wrong the first time around and how you can do better? And Branislav, I don't know if you've got anything there or?
I do, and in fact, actually, I just had a really interesting conversation with my colleagues about that. I really think that both the guiding principle, but also our commitment to engagement is a natural evolution of the previous plan. So I wouldn't say that things didn't work. I think they work very well, but also we have moved on as a society. And so the questions that we were trying to answer, the issues that we were trying to address 10 years ago are different. And hopefully and likely we have been successful in addressing some of those, right? So at this point in time, we need the feedback of the community, in fact, to tell us what the issues are, what the challenges are, knowing again that arts and culture, both with a capital and a small c, are at the very forefront of these societal issues. And this is what we're hearing about equity, about diversity, as much larger issues, not just as pertaining to arts and culture.
Excellent. And Sanjay, with the Edmonton experience, are you finding as well with this new approach with the Connections and Exchanges plan, are you finding that you have learnings from previous Edmonton strategies that are guiding you in this new development, this new strategy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we were very mindful of everything that Branislav has just said in terms of the change, but also one of the key elements of Connections and Exchanges is that unlike other cultural plans that have existed, it is no longer a plan that is static in how it's conceived. So you will notice in Connections and Exchanges that there are no recommendations. There are broad ambitions, there's a vision, there are aims, which are outcomes, and then there are actions that drive the aims. And all of these are designed to be iterative, flexible, and adaptable, because we completely agree in terms of if we want to anticipate where our city is growing, because the plan is for the future, it's not on what came before. It really is about anticipating, not reacting and responding. So really that is an important principle that underlies the plan itself. The other piece, which is really key, is that Edmonton, because of the shifts that are happening and the changes that are going on, I think one of the key elements is that because this is a city plan, alignment with council strategies and Edmonton's own vision was really central to how we designed it. And we were fortuitous because council had begun to articulate a 30-year vision called Vision 2050. And council had articulated a 10 years of strategic goals. And so aligning arts and culture as a driver of city building was absolutely key. Whether arts and culture will now become, after the first 4 years, whether arts and culture will now become essential to Edmonton's identity and how council actually perceives it will be a test. And that's one of the reasons why in building this strategy, we also spent a considerable amount of time with the principle of inclusivity front and center, spent a considerable amount of time in the design of the measurement, evaluation, and learning framework, so that the iterative nature of the plan itself would allow us to make changes and pivot or to drop certain things based on the kinds of processes that would emerge from the communities themselves. So it's a different way of planning. It's not the planning 101, but we want to make sure that arts and culture can actually lead the way towards city building.
Excellent. And we have a question that's come in from Sudbury, and they are asking if any of your culture plans, have they all been conducted in-house, or have they always been done with an external consultant? And Pat, I'll go to you. I don't know if you can speak to both the recent divisional strategy that you've done and previous plans that I know were conducted before you joined the city. Have you found that there's a healthy mix? Is it city staff? Is it consultants? What approach has been done in Toronto?
Thanks for the question, Bridget, and congratulations to the organizers. Really good group, good turnout. It's a mix, to answer your question directly, with a bias towards in-house staff, with contract consultants brought on to complement through front-end research. Certainly, public engagement expertise is something that frequently resides in greater measure outside, sometimes government. So that was the case in our most recent divisional strategy, and was the case also in 2011 with the last full-fledged culture plan, creative capital gains. But there, as I think my co-panelists are mentioning, the interconnectedness of culture, your ability to deliver on your mandate and serve the city is reliant upon the involvement and engagement of other divisions. So bringing it in-house and having also a good internal engagement approach to our culture plan, I think is really, really useful, which is not to say that that is at the exclusion also of deep and meaningful public engagement on the outside. But we found with our divisional strategy, it needs to have follow-up and accountability. So we have struck an external advisors group who were with us through our last divisional strategy, have stayed on as an ad hoc advisory board, which we have complemented with some of the staff for those divisions that we interact with the most, be that transportation or social development planning. And we found that to be really, really useful. And the participants, both external and internal, are saying that that process has been very useful for all to understand how culture can also contribute to the mandates of other divisions and how interdependent we are, ultimately all are as divisions.
Excellent. That brings an interesting point to mind. I know that there are many municipalities, and I think here in Canada, I believe Moncton has implemented an artist in residence program. And I don't know if through your cultural planning, the feedback that you've received from the community is actually bringing artists into the city structure, something that is being discussed and used as a tool to build that relationship between the arts community and the actual policy-making government side of things. There's been great success, I think, with Los Angeles as well, Washington, D.C., where it is about physically bringing in the artists to work with city staff on facilitating cultural planning, cultural policy. Don't know if there's anything that you can speak to about that, Pat, in Toronto, and then I'll check in with Sanjay and Branislav to see what their thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the model we've looked at most is Boston, Artist in Residence and City Divisions program. And there's been a pilot here in Toronto with solid waste management. So as a means of improving social marketing and ability to communicate, they had artists come in and look at actually the process of collection and disposal and ultimately destruction of garbage. And it proved to be very useful, and we hope that it's a project that we'll see replicated in other city divisions. And we frequently are called into action with other city divisions when they do seek to either engage the public or communicate in a very compelling fashion complex policy issues through a cultural vehicle. So it's starting. We hope to see more, and the first pilots have been pretty interesting.
Excellent. And Branislav, just jumping over to Vancouver, any thoughts on that type of approach, an artist residency program of sorts?
So yes, we do actually have different artist in residency programs. I agree with Pat, and Bridget, in a way, you actually mentioned it already. I think they are important in their own right. What we have been hearing from the community, though, is that what we really need to work on is demystifying city processes. So the danger sometimes with having artists in residence in other departments is, to put it very crass, instrumentalization of arts and culture in this case, when the impact needs to be both meaningful and also deep in order to really to enact and to show some real change at a deeper level, and this is a structural level. And in fact, what we're hearing right now, and this is in part because we are not situated in the economic development area, we are really in the community services area that deals with social policy, that deals with housing, that deals with a number of issues that are at the forefront of many different communities. Our biggest challenge is actually reducing barriers, reducing red tape, and figuring out how to demystify city processes so that the community can engage in a meaningful way. So the answer to your question is yes, there are artists in residence, and there is much more work that needs to be done on reducing barriers.
Excellent. And Sanjay, I'd say, actually, before I get to you, Sanjay, I have a follow-up on the solid waste disposal initiative that you spoke about, Pat, and to talk a bit more about the role of the artists in that particular initiative. So they didn't quite fully understand it. So if you have any more that you can add to that, and then I'll go to Sanjay for his thoughts.
Sure. So probably easiest, I'm actually tweeting out a Toronto Star story about it now.
Fantastic.
With the hashtag MC Digital. And I'll put it up in the comment section so that people can follow there.
Fabulous. Thanks, Pat. Great. Okay, so Sanjay, then to go back to the conversation about the role of artists, residency, what have you found through the Arts Council that you've had that interface with the city?
Yes, actually, it was something that came out of the Art of the Living. So the last culture plan, we had a very strong emphasis on making artists, a part of various communities. So besides city departments, we've also had an artist in waste management. We've had an artist at the city. The Indigenous Relations Office at the city has had an artist in residence with them. In addition to all of those things, because the Arts Council is not inside the city, we're outside the city.
Mm-hmm.
We have now actually embarked, in parallel to this Connections and Exchanges, we have embarked on a revision of all the public art policies. And so, not just in terms of becoming administrators of the city policy, but actually becoming co-creators of new policy and having a kind of community-based curatorial role to understand how public art could shift perceptions and become a really important part of neighborhood revitalization, for example, a streetscape revitalization. So we are doing everything, and the plan itself now actually names public art as part of the the outcome. So this is, in my view, sort of public art plans are usually separate, and they kind of are attached to planning departments in most cities. We have been fortunate that we've been given the administration of public art, and so we've now created room for public art as a really important driver of cultural development. And in fact, the focus on the artists now in public art is where we want to go. We really want to create a curatorial narrative for our collection. I just want to say one more thing, that Edmonton is again quite fortuitous because we are the only municipality that actually has a conservation lab. And a lot of our public art is outdoors. They're mostly three-dimensional pieces. Those of you who've been to Edmonton, you know how wonderful the winters can be here. And so, having that expertise in-house now gives us a really holistic way to look at how we can manage the collection and really connect the collection to specific city neighborhoods and really begin to fully realize the intangible value of the collection, not just the economic value of the collection. So how can this city asset be redeployed to create various points of intersection for the citizens of Edmonton to feel a sense of identity and pride, with their neighborhood and their city?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting, just branching off into a slightly different question. With these culture plans, so we want to look at how they get mobilized into action. And I would say in order to be able to do that, there needs to be that trust and that relationship, I think, with the arts community and the cultural community that such plans, in a way, are meant to support. And I know sometimes we have a mix of either consultants or city staff who are working on these plans. I'm wondering if you have any advice or suggestions for the many cultural bureaucrats who are on this call who may be tasked with creating policy, creating such plans, what they can do to either improve those relationships with the community, some practices that they can do to help build that trust, build that, credibility, so that we really can, as city cultural planners, work with the arts and culture community to move such plans forward. And I'm going to go back to Pat really quick, because you did something recently that I was very impressed with. You had an open house at Buddies and Bad Times Theatre where you talked about the plan that you were doing. You had senior city staff with you. I believe City Manager Chris Murray was with you. I just wanted to know if you could talk a bit more about some tips, how you advise your team and your staff to interact with the arts and culture community.
Thanks for the question, Bridget. Yeah, it's as Branislav was saying, I've been in government off and on 20 years, but I've also worked outside, and I am never surprised by the social distance of people from bureaucracies. And it is the first job of anyone in a bureaucracy to demystify, I think was the language that Branislav used. It's absolutely critical. It is even more critical when one gets to those gaps that Branislav was also speaking about earlier. So the further the distance, people facing homelessness, newcomers, et cetera, the greater the obligation. So these town halls are just an attempt to try to demystify a bit what we're doing. It is also, to your question, a means of us opening up the conversation about planning and what we're doing to the conversation in the arts community with respect to advocacy. And because I think it's very important that the bureaucracy play its role in terms of working within a broader system and presenting opportunities for investment in the arts and explaining what that investment will do, while in alignment absolutely with the needs of the arts community. So there needs to be a conversation about that. And at points it hasn't been, I felt, as clear a conversation as it might be. And so we're beginning to talk across those two levels, less about needing more money into the system and more about what that money buys. And we're doing so also as the current economic cycle is probably going to be a bit tighter than might have been the case in the last decade. And so we think we need a fairly sophisticated conversation with taxpayers, with political decision makers about where the money goes and what it does, and how that aligns to civic goals and the priorities of the population as demonstrated through a deep and meaningful public engagement process. So that's essentially the base goal of our conversations. And I think we've been really rewarded with how the arts community in Toronto has responded to an invitation to discuss these things, and reciprocally have invited us in to many fora to talk through these issues.
Excellent. It sounds like you've had great success with it for sure. So, and Branislav, being working inside on the city, have you, through your planning process, taken such transparency steps and initiatives to help demystify? I know you talked about it a bit earlier, but are you finding that it's having an impact, that you're finding that the attitude with the community changes and that there is more of a bond or relationship with the community you're serving?
I think so. I would hope so. Yes. We've done a number of different things. We've tried different approaches. So a couple of months after I arrived, we actually hosted an open house as well, similar to Patrick's, really just to introduce our planners to the community, or reintroduce them. But also, remember, it was to invite those communities and those underrepresented groups who have not been engaging with us for a whole bunch of different reasons, right? And so I don't think that it's a one-off thing. I actually think, to what Sanjay was saying earlier, it has to be an iterative commitment, in fact. And it's also reminding everyone, and I'm just coming out of another meeting where I was talking about this, that we're actually one community. It just happens that we also have funds to distribute and investments to make. It happens that we can actually work with the elected officials to change policies, to create policies, to work on regulations and regulatory frameworks. But all of that, all of those decisions impact all of us. They impact the arts and cultural field, they impact the reconciliation field, they impact the environment area. And so only if we understand that we all work together can we actually really make a meaningful change too. So those, and I call them artificial sometimes, divisions between, you're the bureaucracy and I'm the community, really need to be acknowledged, named, and then tackled head on.
Excellent. And I'm going to just jump to a question. We had Judith from Vancouver's West End. She had referenced that a few years ago they had created a culture plan for Vancouver's West End, and they used a community engaged arts process that was over 6 months, and it had 300 participants who live in the area. And she referenced that the arts themselves can be used to create the policy. So I might throw this over to Sanjay, again, being the head of the Arts Council and going through the process that you are going through now. Are you finding that the arts themselves are being used to help you create that policy? And I hope I have captured that right. Judith, if I'm not paraphrasing your question properly, please jump in on the chat and let me know. But Sanjay, any thoughts on that?
So if I can interpret the question, I'm going to try and interpret it the way I think. One of the things that we're committing ourselves to, and we've committed to through this process, because the Edmonton Arts Council was born of the community, and in a very unique way, not only did the community come together to create the council and free it, essentially it was to free political decision making for funding, but council voted in a motion to create a body that would not be inside the city. So it's very unique. It's not, I don't know if it's ever happened anywhere else, but you know, in terms of our commitment, we are now in 2019. We are going out again to do focused conversations with the arts community around what the implementation framework for the strategy is going to look like. And so everything from our investment programs, so all our granting programs, all our services, our assessment of how we grant, what we grant, who gets it, how do we deal with all of that within the 4 principles that we had used to develop the engagement process. The other piece which is really important is that we will be going to Indigenous communities, because we have a principle in the plan which now binds the 3 organizations that will be implementing the plan. So in addition to the Edmonton Arts Council, there's a Heritage Council, an Arts Habitat Edmonton, and the implementation principle recognizes cultural autonomy and agency of Indigenous peoples, but it's for us to recognize that. And so part of the work is to now build a process with Indigenous communities that will always be about co-creating and collaborating and sharing, rather than us telling us what the strategies are going to be for them. And so that's another important piece of how, as part of that work, we as an Arts Council will have to change our own practices quite dramatically. And so, you know, the way artists are involved in this process, our artists are involved as artists, but also as citizens, not just artists who are making the work, but actually citizens who are contributing to their city and are really driving, you know, this desire for a city that is inclusive and a city that actually respects and values creativity in a fundamental way. And doing that at the city level, you know, the red tape question is a really good question. We are outside the city, but we have great relationships with our colleagues in the city. And how can the Arts Council begin to be more ingrained? We are, in a way, but how can we be more ingrained with everything that the city does? Whether it's, resurfacing a road or creating a new park, where is the arts in that? And can the artists not push the boundaries of how that can happen? So from a planning perspective, it's a bit frightening for some planners, but I've been very, very fortunate that my colleagues at the city have been very open. And I think we will achieve quite a lot.
Excellent, great. And I'm going to go to a question from our friends at the BC Alliance, and I'm hoping that this will help steer the conversation more towards the resiliency question that I know, Pat, you and I chatted about. So the BC Alliance is asking about what other advocacy roles can you play in your community that will not be seen as adversarial to your local government? And I'm hoping that this might span into a conversation about, well, taking cultural planning and integrating it into many different facets of city planning and city building. So it's not necessarily seen as adversarial, but perhaps just the norm. So I'm kind of twofold a question, but I'm hoping you might be able to talk a bit more about that. Like, what else can people do in their community? What other advocacy roles, so that they're not seen as being adversarial to the government? And then perhaps we can go into talking about integrating into resiliency strategies and other city building plans.
Who are you asking?
Oh, I was asking Pat, but I see that he's on mute. I just had a note. Sorry, Pat.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was...
No worries at all. And I've been tweeting. So did you catch that last question?
Yeah, I did. I think, well, I think a two-sided answer. The first is there are many great examples of where the arts, whether it be placemaking, tourism, economic recovery, community resilience, have an important role to play. And I put up on the feed one example in Toronto, the Bloor Street Cultural Corridor. So I think there are many. I think the danger that my co-panelists have touched on at this point too is casting oneself too frequently or deeply in an instrumentalist role, which, depending on political tides of a given day, can work against you at some point. So I think doing what is right for the community, such as it's defined by those community-engaged artists, can protect against that and the mission drift that you do see sometimes accompanying an overly aggressive instrumentalist strategy. So if that makes sense, that'd be my response to that.
Excellent. And so I'm going to go over to Branislav then and talk about how you were looking at ways though to take some of the concerns or issues that have come up in your consultations and working with other city divisions to make sure that their policies or procedures address those concerns. Are you able to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Okay. I'm getting a thumbs up. Yep.
So there's a number of different dimensions to the questions, and I think they're all equally important. But they also touch on something that you were asking about earlier, which is just generally, what is actually the community's role? How can community advocate better? And it goes back to my whole notion that we are just one community and we need to understand each other and each other's priorities really, really well in order to do that. Now, understanding each other's priorities also means understanding each other's contexts, each other's issues, each other's challenges too. And to your question, we are actually in the middle of doing a number of really big pieces of not just policy, but actually strategic work in the city. So the resilient cities, the resilient strategy is going to be presented to the council in the next month or two. We have the Healthy City Strategy Restart, as well as the Greenest City Restart. These are huge pieces of work that have been guiding cities' priorities and investments over the past 10 years. Now, this came as a surprise to me, and then when I thought about it, I thought, well, you're so stupid, it should have never been a surprise in the first place. But everything that has been surfacing through the community engagement with these different strategies, in fact, not just correlates, but is sometimes identical to what we have been surfacing too, right? So the equity questions, the inclusion questions, the accessibility and access questions, reconciliation in its many, many guises, the way it actually guides our work, has been something that has been surfacing over and over again. And so it's not like we necessarily have to convince other departments in the city of what it is that a community has on its mind. It is more a mechanical question, and this is something that a community has brought to us too. How do we, to Sanjay's point, how do we actually put arts and culture at the heart of city planning? And to do that, we really have to see what the mechanisms are that the planning is using to do land use planning, that engineering is using to do many, many different things that they do, our Vancouver Charter, through the legal obligations, ties us to do as well, right? And so this is really the work that we need to do internally. And so my focus is always kind of bifold. It's this external conversation, it's this external gathering of data and this meaningful engagement, and then translation of that into internal processes to the, I guess, to the extent that we can actually do them. Reconciliation is a really good example, as is resilience in this case, and you were asking about resilience. The public engagement that has come back to us through the resilience work, of course, has as a number one question, what happens with seismic upgrades when the big earthquake hits? Everyone here on the West Coast is afraid of that. But a second and incredibly important question that came up earlier is, what does the community resilience look like? And what role do arts and culture play in that? And to that effect, actually, the Resilience Office has engaged with artists to deliver a number of programs, and are actually working with someone from Melbourne very soon to actually see what Melbourne has done on the resilience work, on the resiliency work, and how any of that can be translated here.
Excellent. And I'm just going to segue that into one of the questions that we had. It jumps more into the integration of built heritage, natural heritage, and heritage planning into municipal cultural initiatives. So I'm going to jump to Sanjay, and I don't know if through your work in Edmonton, do you have any concrete examples where, in addition to everything else, you've integrated or you've accounted for built heritage, natural heritage, and what role that plays in your plan?
So I don't want to speak on behalf of my heritage colleagues, but the Edmonton Heritage Council was an outcome of the last plan. It actually was incubated from the Art of Living. It was a recommendation. There are in Edmonton, there is within the heritage sector, because of the diversity of the sector itself, there are other networks and other organizations like the Historical Society and I mean the sort of historical board and other kinds of mechanisms that advise City Council on various things. The end of the day, when it comes to built heritage and the preservation of built heritage and the deployment of built heritage to animate community, you know, a lot of it is dependent on provincial legislation. And so at the municipal level, it becomes a little bit difficult. And because we're not inside the city, we're kind of outside. I think those are conversations that need to happen. There is a good sort of intersection between the neighborhood, the community, heritage spaces, and how can those spaces be sort of redeployed and become part of a living legacy or a living heritage, so that the conservation and protection of built heritage actually finds new life with artists in there, right? And so in Ontario, there is an example of this when the Heritage Act was amended, I don't know how many years ago now, 10, 15 years ago. There were heritage conservation districts that were created, and municipalities were given the job of actually ensuring that those districts remain vibrant. It's happened in a few cases, but not very many. Those municipalities that were forward-looking and actually brought in artists and brought in the development community that was interested in ensuring that the identity of a neighborhood was important. Those HCDs have really borne some really interesting results and have really ensured that the process of gentrification doesn't come and sweep the artists away. In fact, artists become a really important part of how a neighborhood becomes vibrant, and they continue to live in the neighborhood. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but you know, I mean, that's how I feel, and the plan kind of Connections and Exchanges looks at the programmatic elements of how people can be engaged and work together rather than built heritage in and of itself.
Absolutely. And that actually leads nicely into another question that we received, and I'm cognizant of the time, so this will be, I think, our last question before we wrap things up. So this is speaking about how the cultural plans are addressing cultural infrastructure. So capital investment for creative spaces, affordable housing for artists, property tax on creative spaces. And I know especially in Toronto and in Vancouver, this is quite the issue with property being as expensive as it is. So I'll go to Pat, and just to get your thoughts on that, hopefully touch base with Branislav, and I think we'll have just enough time before I have to wrap it up. Pat?
Great. Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, Branislav and I have been tweeting over each other here about the components of our respective cultural plans that speak to the protection and provision of cultural infrastructure. So in rapidly densifying, gentrifying cities like those two, spaces is at an absolute premium, and there are many perverse effects that we have from what has been a decade-long bull run in the economy. So it is not surprisingly, therefore, space, one of 4 issues that dominate our divisional strategy, and it is at a very lived fashion what dominates a lot of our work. So we work on tax policy, we work with our colleagues in zoning around land use. We are working right now, we are trying to figure out given the quickly evolving creative labor market, how we meaningfully intervene to allow for the protection of not-for-profit co-working facilities that serve creative workers and increasing. But like, this is a fast-moving sector with about one new enterprise per week coming online. So it's a really, you know, active brief, as they say in the UK, and we spend lots and lots of time on it. But it is absolutely critical that that we address these perverse effects of economic growth.
Excellent. And Branislav, anything to add to that on a last thought?
So yes, and in fact, everything that Pat said, and we have been talking about this actually for a while, because of the issues around gentrification and affordability and displacement, this is one of the pillars actually of our work. We look after cultural infrastructure within our department, so there is a whole division that really only deals with this. We have in 2018 presented to the council, and council approved the cultural infrastructure plan. And the key objectives, just to give you an idea of what they are, because they're very important, to actually make sure that arts and culture are a key priority in city building. I already talked about that. To expand tools to secure, enhance, and develop spaces. That's the second one. To incorporate equity, access, and reconciliation in all our considerations. To partner with community to preserve, enhance, and develop new spaces. And I'm just reading this because it's important to get it right. And the last one is to support community-led capacity and leadership. That's actually one of the most important ones as we go forward. And so if there is interest, and I left it in the little chat area, we actually do have our Making Space for Arts and Culture, the infrastructure plan for Vancouver, online. So please have a look at it. It's a comprehensive plan that touches on so many things that are incredibly important for this sector right now.
Excellent, great. And Sanjay, we got about 4 minutes before I have to wrap it up. Any last thoughts too on that topic?
Just that we have Arts Habitat Edmonton, who is a partner in delivering the connections and exchanges. And one of the actions, there are several actions, but one of the actions that are specific to what we just discussed is that Edmonton, over the next 4 years, will be in a position to adopt a cultural infrastructure plan.
Excellent.
Which will be the first of its kind for the city.
Great, glad to hear it. And on that note, again, I know we've just scratched the surface on this topic, so I wanted to encourage you all to continue to share resources, thoughts, what have you, at the Knowledge Center, and you should have the link right there. There should be a Mass Culture pop-up that will take you directly to the conversation. And we're really hoping that this does become a resource where we can all go to for benchmarking, environmental scanning, all of that information that we all need to help push our work forward. I just want to take a moment to thank Pat, Sanjay, and Branislav. Thank you so much for being our conversation starters today. Really appreciate your insights. Yeah, and to Liz and all the team over here at the Ontario Trillium Foundation and Mass Culture, wanted to thank them for their time. And most importantly, I have to say, again, the attendee list for this webinar absolutely blew my mind. There are so many incredible people who are working across the country in the cultural planning field, the arts programming field. And I sincerely wanted to thank you for all the work that you are doing in your communities. This is necessary and vital work. And I know that sometimes we don't hear thank you enough. And so I just wanted to say thank you, and also encourage you to share your thoughts and your feedback on a survey that will be sent around. Again, this is an experiment. It's a new format. And I'm being told that the link for the survey will be shared via the chat box. So please do give us your feedback. Again, it's a new model. We're tweaking it. We want it to be a usable resource, and that Knowledge Center will be monitored. Any questions or discussion that is there, it will be answered. It won't go unattended. So please do continue the conversation. And on that note, I think we are right at 2:30. So just wanted to say thanks again, and we hope that you'll join us again soon at the next Mass Culture Digital Gathering. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.